Jupiter and His Mighty Company End the Golden Age by James Baldwin. A long time ago, when the world was much younger than it is now, people told and believed a great many wonderful stories about wonderful things which neither you nor I have ever seen. They often talked about a certain mighty being called Jupiter or Zeus, who was king of the sky and the earth. And they said that he sat most of the time among the clouds on the top of a very high mountain, where he could look down and see everything that was going on in the earth beneath. He liked to ride on the storm clouds and throw burning thunderbolts right and left among the trees and rocks, and he was so very, very mighty that when he nodded, the earth quaked, the mountains trembled and smoked, and the sky grew black, and the sun hid his face. Jupiter had two brothers, both of them terrible fellows, but not nearly so great as himself. The name of one of them was Neptune, or Poseidon, and he was the king of the sea. He had a sparkling golden palace far down in the deep sea caves where the fishes live and the red coral grows. And whenever he was angry, the waves would rise mountain high, and the storm winds would howl fearfully, and the sea would try to break over the land, and men called him the shaker of the earth. The other brother of Jupiter was a sad, pale-faced being, whose kingdom was underneath the earth, where the sun never shined, and where there was darkness and crying and sorrow all the time. His name was Pluto, or Aidoneus, and his country was called the lower world, or the land of shadows, or Hades. Men said that whenever anyone died, Pluto would send his messenger to carry that one down into his cheerless kingdom, and for that reason they never spoke well of him, but thought of him only as the enemy of life. A great number of other mighty beings lived with Jupiter among the clouds on the mountain top, about whom you will learn by and by, and about whom men told strange and beautiful stories. They lived in golden mansions, high up among the clouds, so high indeed that the eyes of men could never see them, but they could look down and see what men were doing, and oftentimes they were said to leave their homes and wander unknown across the land or over the sea. And of all these mighty folk, Jupiter was by far the mightiest. The Golden Age. Jupiter and his mighty folk had not always lived among the clouds on the mountaintop. In times long past, a wonderful family called Titans had lived there and had ruled over all the world. They said that their father was the sky and their mother the earth. They had the form and looks of men and women, but they were much larger and far more beautiful. The name of the youngest of these Titans was Saturn, and yet he was so very old that men often called him Father Time. He was the king of the Titans, and so, of course, was the king of all the earth besides. Men were never so happy as they were during Saturn's reign. It was the true golden age then. The springtime lasted all the year. The woods and meadows were always full of flowers, and the music of singing birds was heard every day and every hour. It was summer and autumn, too, at the same time. Apples and oranges always hung ripe from the trees, and there were purple grapes on the vines, and melons and berries of every kind, which the people had but to pick and eat. Of course, nobody had to do any kind of work in that happy time. There was no such thing as sickness or sadness or old age. Men and women lived for hundreds and hundreds of years and never became gray or wrinkled or sick, but were always handsome and young. They had no need of houses, for there were no cold days, nor storms, nor anything to make them afraid. Nobody was poor, for everybody had the same precious things: the sunlight, the pure air, the wholesome water of the springs, the grass for a carpet, the blue sky for a roof, the fruit and flowers of the woods and meadows. So of course, no one was richer than another, and there was no money, nor any locks or bolts, for everybody was everybody's friend, and no man wanted to get more of anything than his neighbors had. When these happy people had lived long enough, they fell asleep, and their bodies were seen no more. They flew away through the air, and over the mountains, and across the sea, to a flowery land in the distant west. And some men say that even to this day, they are wandering happily here and there about the earth, blessing mankind everywhere. What a pity it is that this golden age should have to come to an end. But it was Jupiter and his brothers who brought about the sad change. It is hard to believe it, but men say that Jupiter was the son of the old Titan king, Saturn, and that he was hardly a year old when he began to plot how he might wage war against his father. As soon as he was grown up, he persuaded his brothers, Neptune and Pluto, to join him, and they vowed that they would drive the Titans from the earth. Then followed a long and terrible war. But Jupiter had many mighty helpers. A company of one-eyed monsters called Cyclops were kept busy all the time, creating thunderbolts in the fire of burning mountains. 3 other monsters, each with 100 hands, were called in to throw rocks and trees against the fort of the Titans, and Jupiter himself hurled his sharp lightning darts so fast that the woods were set on fire and the water in the rivers boiled with the heat. Of course, good, quiet old Saturn and his brothers and sisters could not hold out always against such enemies as these. At the end of 10 years, they had to give up and beg for peace. They were bound in chains of the hardest rock and thrown into a prison in the lower worlds, and the Cyclops and the 100-handed monsters were sent there to be their jailers and keep guard over them forever. Then men began to grow dissatisfied with their lives. Some wanted to be rich and own all the good things in the world. Some wanted to be kings and rule over the others. Some who were strong wanted to make slaves of those who were weak. Some broke down the fruit trees in the woods in case others should eat the fruit. Some hunted the timid animals, which had always been their friends, for fun. Some even killed these poor creatures and ate their flesh for food. At last, instead of everybody being everybody's friend, everybody was everybody's enemy. So in all the world, instead of peace, there was war. Instead of plenty, there was starvation. Instead of innocence, there was crime. And instead of happiness, there was misery. And that was the way in which Jupiter made himself so mighty. And that was the way in which the Golden Age came to an end.